Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome all of you who are here with us in the room and also those who are joining by live streaming. My name is Richard Snyder. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Brown University. And it's really just a thrill for many reasons to have everyone here today to celebrate the publication recently of this wonderful new book by my friends and colleagues, Guy Edwards and Timmins Roberts, A Fragmented Continent, Latin America and the Global Politics of Climate Change. I'm just going to quickly do a few things in addition to welcoming everyone. I want to first acknowledge the institutions, or at least some of the institutions, that helped make today's event possible. And I want to mention, of course, the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, with which the Center for Latin American Studies is affiliated. I also want to mention the Climate and Development Lab at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. And I also want to mention the partnership that we have with the Sustainability Strategy Group, Novella. So thank you to those sponsors for their support of today's event. So I'm gonna make a few brief remarks about the book at the outset. We're going to hear a lot more from our two discussants. Actually, we have four discussants today. And then when I finish with my remarks, I'll introduce the whole panel, including Timmins and Guy, to you, and that will be my work for the day. So the book, first of all, let me say that one of the important strategic focus points for the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, which I've been directing for 6 years now, is the environment and is Latin America and its role in climate change. And thus it's very appropriate that CLACS is represented today. And I also should say that it's been a pleasure personally and professionally to have worked with the students and also with Guy and Timmins over the last 6 years, actually. On issues of environmental challenges and climate change concerning Latin America and the Caribbean. So the book, and you can get this from the endorsements of the book, and also by reading the lovely preface, or actually foreword, by the former president of Chile, Ricardo Lagos, who also served, you may not know, after he was president of Chile, he served several years as the envoy, the United Nations Special Envoy on climate change from 2008 to 2010. So it's a topic that he cares about. And from his foreword and the endorsements, you get a sense that this book really does fill an important void. We just don't have much rigorous scholarly knowledge about Latin America's role in the global politics of climate change until now. And what the book does, it charts the evolution and also the shifting and moving strategic postures and policy positions, both domestic policy and also international public policy, across the region over the last 25 years. Since the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio put the problem of climate change firmly on the public, at least, radar map. And we learn from the book about different strategies that countries pursue over time for grappling with the complex tensions and trade-offs across important goals like economic growth, social equity, democracy, and of course, sustainability. And the different ways you can't, all good things don't go together. It's an old saw. They're trade-offs. And in the ideal world, all things would go together. But there are trade-offs and tensions, and we see how countries and real political actors and policymakers and also civil society actors manage the tensions and trade-offs among these four desirable goals. The book also does an admirable job of disaggregating the region of Latin America. The title of the book conveys this, A Fragmented Continent. There's also a felicitous subtitle in the book, A Continent of Blocks. That's blocks, B-L-O-C, not to be confused with a blocked continent. which would be a different concept. So a continent of blocks, and they show how, for example, some of the so-called New Left governments of recent years in Ecuador, in Venezuela, and Bolivia continue to be countries dependent on fossil fuels, whereas countries such as Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, and Mexico, in interesting ways, have been pursuing some innovative vanguard strategies of offering voluntary and significant reductions in carbon emissions. They're grouped in the so-called ILAC association, which we'll be hearing about from the commentator. So that's all I wanted to say about the book in sort of a normal academic way. I want to say a few things about the production of the book, about the production of knowledge. And I want to make the argument that this book differs in some really interesting ways from the stylized view that we have of how academic scholarship and books are produced. There's a lot of hidden stuff behind any book. This is usually stuff you hear about in the preface, where usually an author or authors will apologize to their children and their spouses and their friends for being absent, for the year or two or more while they were working on the book, and so forth. And, acknowledging what's often called the invisible college, that is the network of colleagues and peers who criticized and prodded and gave helpful feedback or unhelpful feedback along the way. Now, that's in this book as well. I won't say it isn't. But if your idea of the production of an academic book is it's a lone scholar, or maybe two or three scholars working together in a single discipline, and it's the product of years of toiling in a library or two, maybe with some field work by the authors, maybe even drawing on some of their own real-life experiences. Well, that's not the kind of process that led to the book here. What's different about this book, first of all, the nature of the subject matter. Climate change, even if you're only focusing on just one region of the world, it's a pretty big, woolly, complex, multifaceted beast. And it requires a multidisciplinary approach. You need to have a handle on earth science. You need to have a handle on public policy and political science. Not just domestic policy, but international, foreign policy. You need to have a handle on political economy. You need to have a handle, if you take civil society and non-governmental organizations seriously, you need to have a handle on social movements and sociological perspectives on association and mobilization. The book also doesn't engage in the normal method of participant observation, which isn't all that common, where the author, the scholar, the analyst actually participates, but in something different, which the authors label, I think it's a pretty cool term, participatory action research. Participatory action research. What is that? My interpretation of it, it's basically a form of advocacy, but it's scientifically validated advocacy. So concretely, the authors participated in multiple years of United Nations conferences on climate change and various other events, interacted with politicians and civil society actors, but not passively. They were engaged and they actively tried to disseminate scientifically validated information that would be of help to the decision makers. And I also should add that maybe like a more conventional book, this sort of grew out of the research program of a senior tenured academic. The guy with, like me, a little less hair than other folks around the table, but whatever, Timmons. However, unconventionally, the first co-author, Guy Edwards, doesn't really fit into the usual academic slots. Guy doesn't have a PhD, at least not yet. I learned about him because he was running a blog on climate change while also working at an ecotourism lodge in the Amazon part of Ecuador. that's not a conventional co-author on on an academic MIT or Oxford or Cambridge press. Yet, as you'll see, he's an indispensable part of the whole project. The other thing that was interesting, the book was tied closely into pedagogy. Guy and Timmons taught courses over the last 5 or 6 years with dozens and dozens of our students, both undergraduate and graduate, taking the classes and contributing and actively learning by going with their teachers to the annual UN conferences on climate change. And not only observing, but then producing reports back from Cancun, where one of the conferences, back from Copenhagen, from Durban, etc., and Lima. And in fact, we have 2 current undergraduates who I'll introduce to you in a minute, Camila Bustos and Jimena Carranza. Did I get your last name right? Carranza, yes. Who are current Brown undergraduates who can tell you about the pedagogical dimension of all of this. And as I said, we have 2 students here today, but there really are dozens who could have been here, who have graduated and so forth. Lastly, and not least, the book involved a coalition of institutional supporters in order to make this possible. And, you know, luckily for us, we had Ricardo Lagos, former president of Chile and the former UN envoy on climate change, here with us at Brown as a professor at large at the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies and also at Watson over a 6-year period. I mean, nobody scripted that. That just sort of happened. He was here, and Guy and Timmons and their team took advantage of Lagos's presence, as did I, and we worked together to use the convening power that he offered to put together some really meaningful programming, it's called, but these are conferences. And we did this over the last 5 or 6 years, and that also fed in to the production of this book in important ways. So we had, in 2011, here in this room, the conference Latin American Climate Change, Regional Perspectives on a Global Problem. And you'll see Ricardo Lagos, former president of Chile, also Marina Silva was here in this room, the former Secretary of the Environment of Brazil, and also an important presidential candidate recently as well. And then we also had a number of other public policy folks, civil society members, and academics here, and this is now 5 years ago, in April 2011. And there were a number of other conferences and things along the way. More recently, 3 years later, sort of as a follow-up to this was in April of 2014, so about 2 years ago, we had an event governing climate change, which featured, again, Ricardo Lagos, the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, who was important because his government hosted the Cancun conference of the UN on climate change in 2010, which is credited with reviving the process, which had sort of hit a wall the previous year in Copenhagen. And what we did self-consciously, this was Guy and Timmons. Their idea was to bring together the architects of the successful Cancun event of 2010 with the architects of the upcoming, at that point, conference in Lima, Peru, the subsequent conference upcoming of the UN climate change talks. So basically, to make this room and Brown and this network a site for active, self-conscious learning. In other words, to transmit knowledge from those who were involved in a successful UN event in Cancun on to those who were in charge of a subsequent summit in Lima, Peru. And it had an impact. We heard back from President Lagos after this event. He was in Lima for something else, something involving climate change. It wasn't the big conference in Lima. He was there for something else. He said that everybody was talking about what they had learned from meeting here at Brown. So this has been, as I said, for me personally, very fulfilling and exciting, and it's just been a joy to be able to convene all of these different stakeholders in an iterated way over time. So there's a lot behind this book. I think it's an amazing example of multifaceted, complex, globalized, timely, and generous scholarship to tackle what is a multifaceted, complex, and urgent global problem. And the making of this book, I think you see it if you read the preface and see the long, long list of names that are mentioned. This book has touched, the producing of the book has touched more lives than most books do. Maybe that's because the problem it addresses is also touching many more lives than most problems do. And before I introduce the participants, let me say the story's not over. In fact, Guy and Timmons are very forward-looking, and they want to focus today on the last United Nations Climate Change Summit held in Paris just as the book was being published. So we're going to be learning new things that isn't even covered in the book, because the problem of climate change is still with us. So there'll be more books and more coalitions and collaborations that will need to be done going forward. Okay, so let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then I will take a seat. So first we'll start with Timmons Roberts. He is the Idelson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology here at Brown University, where he's also the co-director of Brown's Climate and Development Lab. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Timmons is the co-author and editor of 12 books and edited volumes and over 80 articles and book chapters. His current research focuses on climate change and economic development. He's also a co-founder of AIDdata.org, and is part of an international effort to produce a major leap in transparency in financing around climate issues as well as in foreign aid more broadly. He's also a leader locally in Rhode Island's efforts to plan for climate change. He helped create the Rhode Island Climate Change Commission in 2010. The legislation forming that commission was written by him and his Brown students, and in 2014 he led a group that successfully passed the first comprehensive climate legislation in the state of Rhode Island. Guy Edwards is a research fellow and co-director of the Climate and Development Lab at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. He's also an associate at the Sustainability Strategy Group, Nivella. He's also co-founder and former editor of the blog that I referred to a little earlier, Intercambio Climatico. Guy has worked with the Latin American Platform on Climate and in their Latin America office. He's also worked for the Overseas Development Institute, the consultancy River Path Associates, and as a resident manager of the Guarani Eco Lodge in the Ecuadorian Amazon. He's written numerous academic papers, policy briefs, and articles for a broad range of publications, including The Guardian, La Tercera in Chile, the Brookings Institute, the Americas Quarterly, and Chatham House. I want to introduce our panelists now who will be discussing the book. One of them, I'm told, well, she's not here, but she will be here at some point. So why don't I first introduce the person who's here, and then Natalie, and then I'll introduce Isabel. So Natalie Unterstell is a Louis Bacon Environmental Leadership Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School Center for Public Leadership. She was a member of the government of Brazil's negotiating team at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and she also acted as a civil society observer to negotiations prior to that. Her research focuses on the economic analysis of climate change risks and associated adaptation strategies. I'll introduce the people who are here first, and then we'll see if Isabel shows up. So we have as I said, two undergraduates at Brown who will participate today. Maria Camila Bustos is a senior studying international relations and environmental studies here at Brown. Her research focuses on sustainable development, human rights, and climate change with a special focus on Latin America. Camila is a lead researcher at Nivella and a member of Brown's Climate and Development Lab. She's currently writing an honors thesis about Colombia's foreign policy on climate change. And after finishing at Brown, she'll work at the Colombian think tank in Bogota de Justicia as a researcher looking at climate-induced displacement and the human rights implications of that displacement. And then to Camila's left, we have Ximena Carranza, who is a junior at Brown studying environmental science. She is also a researcher at the Climate and Development Lab at Brown, as well as at Nivela, and she focuses on the international climate negotiations, subnational climate policies, and also on media coverage of climate and energy in Latin America. She's also done research locally on adaptation and urban vulnerabilities here in Providence, Rhode Island, and has worked as a climate change research intern at the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi, India, as a fellow of the Brown India Initiative. Well, I think I'll tell you about Isabel and hope that she arrives soon. So Isabel Cavalier Adarve is a lawyer specializing in public international law and international environmental law with extensive experience in climate change. She's currently the Minister Counselor at the Permanent Mission of Colombia to the United Nations in New York City. Between 2014 and 2015, she was the first team leader of the support unit for the negotiating group, the Independent Association of Latin American and the Caribbean, or ILAC. And before that, she served as an advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Colombia and was a lead negotiator on climate finance issues for Colombia, as well as deputy head of delegation for Colombia in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations. Okay, so now you know who everybody is. I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague Timmons Roberts, and please enjoy the rest of the event.
First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming, and welcome to people who are out in webland. We appreciate you watching. I can't really express how grateful I am to Rich Snyder for what he's done supporting this project. It has been, as you said, a very unconventional project, and you know, the hiring of Guy Edwards was always a tenuous thing, and you somehow had a trust and a understanding of what we were trying to do at a time when we needed it, and there were many of those times. And I think it's a reflection of what a great person can do inside of an institution that has some resources, as Brown University has tremendous opportunities for students, opportunities for faculty, and really an opportunity to make ourselves useful to the world that I think you've made possible. So you've been like our godfather, and appropriate with the leather jacket today, too. And I want to thank everybody else who helped us. I mean, some of our great collaborators are here, and then, of course, these events. Again, to be able to bring people in and have funding for that was really extraordinary opportunities. So it's been fantastic. And then also I have to thank Guy for all this really, you know, hanging in there through some ups and downs of getting this project from the beginning to this great ending, and he's been fantastic. So, but all right, you've heard enough of that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is go right for the end, right to the sort of the moment that we're in right now. So I'm setting this up by talking about Paris. So in December, right, just a month and a half ago, the countries of the world came together in Paris and talked about climate change, and it is seen largely as a breakthrough agreement. I would say that there are good and bad things about this agreement. As George Monbiot said in the Guardian newspaper, you could look at it as a disaster, or you could look at it as a miracle. And in fact, it was kind of both a disaster in that it did not get us to the levels of reductions in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we need to stay safe. It also was a miracle that the countries of the world came together and agreed on something. So I'm going to talk about five things that were good about Paris and 5 things that were not good about Paris, because I happen to agree with him. So first of all, there was kind of a breakthrough in Paris on multilateralism. As Rich said, the Mexicans really saved the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Cancun in 2010 through some excellent diplomacy and kind of lowering the expectations, unfortunately, but that's what apparently was needed to keep the whole thing together. And the French did that again this last year, held the system together with some great leadership, with the support of the Peruvian team, who were here in this room 2 years before, a year and a half ago now, 2 years ago now. So it was a success for multilateralism. And part of that was sort of a new kind of universalism, that there's in the Paris Agreement that we're going to talk about a lot, a new situation where all countries have some kind of pledging that they did. And it's not just the northern countries, the rich countries, that were expected to move, but rather all countries. So this is something we have to talk a lot about. Why did this long-standing tension and divide between the global north and the global south? It didn't disappear. It really, we saw it again in Paris, but it was different this time. Something was different. So the question is what, so that would be number one. The second thing, and I think this was really important, was that we had the rollout in the whole year before Paris of these national climate plans. So the terminology is the intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs, which is UN jargon for a pledge by a country on what they're going to do about climate change. So the beginning of that process really was the US and China making an announcement in November of 2014, which in some ways sort of broke the logjam, that all of a sudden, the big actors were finally doing something, and together they account for almost half the problem of climate change. So to have the two big actors making pledges, and they were very different kind of pledges, was a big deal. Now, day before yesterday, right, the Supreme Court of the United States put a stay on the core of the US pledge, that is the Clean Power Plan of the Obama administration, which basically where he said the EPA should go ahead and use all of its tools in the Clean Air Act to push the US's actions on climate change as far as possible. And he had to do that because the Congress had not acted in the 6 years before that. He said at the beginning of his term, say 7 years ago, that act, Congress, you must act. If you don't act, I'm going to do it myself. So he's done it himself, and now we're seeing a constitutional battle working itself out between the Supreme Court, the presidency, and the Congress. And then there's the issue of states and what's asked of the states. So unfortunately, one of the core stones of the foundation that made Paris a success, which was the U.S. finally acting, the pledge was 26 to 28% reductions by 2025 off of our 1990 level emissions. That pledge that cornerstone is now really uncertain. And I had an NGO in Europe ask me yesterday, how should we respond? The U.S. needs to be acting. Shouldn't U.S. citizens be pushing the U.S. government to meet our pledge? But in this role, the lead up to Paris, there was 188 countries came in with these national climate plans, the INDCs, accounting for over 95% of all global emissions. Basically everyone, and we can talk a lot more about those. Thirdly, there's a cycle involved in the Paris Agreement, a 5-year pledging cycle. So even though this round is not really adequate in terms of how much emission reductions we got, every 5 years they're going to come back, and they're going to do a global stock take. That's the fourth thing, where they're going to see, all right, where are we? What do these pledges add up to? Does it actually get us where we need to go? And then we can go back again and make hopefully stronger pledges. And in fact, it has a ratchet mechanism that they have to get stronger. And then the fifth thing that I think that was really surprisingly good in Paris was 1.5 degrees of warming was in the text. And it's sort of aspirational. It says stay as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. That's above pre-industrial levels. We are currently at about 1 degree warming, and this is Celsius above where the temperatures were of global averages 100 years ago before the big industrial revolution. So 1.5 degrees language got in there, and the 2 degrees goal was confirmed. And anyway, there's a long story behind that and why that ended up in the document, and it's a fascinating one that, in fact, some of the members of our team of the Climate and Development Lab were there with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the CVF, a group of the most vulnerable countries, and some of those are in Latin America. Okay, so now those are the good thing, there's the good news, now the bad news, sorry. We're still, the expectation is you put all these pledges together and you still get 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. That's above what's considered safe. And in fact, that may be very optimistic. It may be over 3 degrees, and it could be even more than that, especially if countries don't meet their pledges. And that gets us to the big deal, which is that it's not binding, that there's also really not a recourse or enforcement mechanism. There's no way to go, send in police helicopters to stop people from, violating their INDC. What are we going to do? There's not even a mechanism like there was in the Kyoto Protocol from '97, which said, if you don't meet your pledges in the first commitment period, then you got to do better in the second commitment period. So that's one of the big things. And so there's not really an accountability mechanism. And then the big one that I focus on is climate finance. So in Copenhagen, there was a pledge made for $100 billion a year to start flowing, to be sort of ramped up to, scaled up by 2020, in which wealthy countries would help the developing countries adapt to the impacts of climate change and reduce their emissions so that they wouldn't have to bear the burden of resolving this problem that, in fact, the wealthier countries are largely responsible for having created. Of course, the world is changing. China, Brazil, India, South Africa, and other rapidly developing countries are putting more of the carbon into the atmosphere. But most of the stuff that's up there now is the stuff that we put up there. So anyway, the idea was that they shouldn't have to destroy their economies in order to deal with climate change. So as India said, we can either dig up our soft coal, or you can help us put in solar plants. And in fact, that's a pretty good option for everybody if that extra funding is available. Unfortunately, the language in the Paris Agreement was terrible on this, in my opinion. I think finance is a disaster. So the language was, developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to both mitigation and adaptation in continuation of their existing obligations under the convention, that is the 1992 Framework Convention. But did you hear that language? Developing countries shall provide financial resources to assist. Well, they are already, but it's not clear how much.
Right?
What?
Developed.
Yeah, developed, sorry. So, yeah, thank you. So the idea is that this language doesn't make clear who, when, how much, and so on. It's just very vague language. And if you go to the convention and read Article 4.3, you'll read the language that should have been there. That it should be new and additional funding, that it should be the agreed full costs of doing these climate actions, that it should be adequate and that it should be predictable, and there should be a burden sharing formula, that it should be shared in an equitable way of the countries that cause the problem. Not in the language anymore. So anyway, that's my big bone, one of my big bones with the Paris Agreement. So I could go on about this. I want to pass this over to Guy as quickly as I can, but firstly I just want to say what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of questions going down the table, so it'll be snappy and more interesting than us guys standing up here at the beginning. I think Rich has really set this up nicely by saying all good things don't go together. There are trade-offs. That's, I think, really what we are interested in, and what I'm interested in as a sociologist. I think we need to understand the actors, the systems that are driving the problem, barriers to solutions, and then to talk about how we're going to get around those barriers. So I think I will hand this off to Guy Edwards as I say thank you all for coming, and thanks Rich again.
Great. Thanks, Tim, and thanks very much, Rich, for that very generous introduction. So we want to get started on the discussion ASAP. So I'm just going to tie together what Rich mentioned about the book with what Tim said about the Paris Agreement. And I think the key thing to start with is the UN climate change talks in Paris were significant given the unprecedented coalitions, informal kind of groupings of countries I've got one, thank you, that came together, especially small island states, a number of Latin American countries. So I think we can describe Paris as, to some extent, a diplomatic success for Latin American countries. And this isn't some kind of fleeting kind of thing that just came out of nowhere. This leadership from the region has been kind of brewing for a number of years. We put it back to about 2005. So we can really see how these different actors have kind of come together to help push the negotiations in a useful direction. So we've heard about Brazil, and that's one group or one country that we focus on. It partners with India, South Africa, and China at the negotiations. So that's one of our main case studies that we look at. We then look at the Bolivarian Alliance for the People of Our Americas, which is made up of Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Cuba. So that's our other group that we look at, and this group has been very active in pushing respect at the UNFCCC for respect for multilateral procedures, and also trying to promote civil society voices within the UN negotiation space. And these countries have been quite feisty, I think that's one way of putting it, but they've also been really playing a key role in trying to promote a certain discourse of climate justice, which is rather contentious, but an important role nonetheless. And our final group is called ILAC, which is the Independent Association of Latin America and the Caribbean, which has 8 countries, among them Peru, Colombia, Chile, and Costa Rica. And so those are our main groups. So the book, what we really do is try and investigate whether Latin American countries play this important role at the UNFCCC negotiations, whilst offering potential solutions to try and confront climate change back home. But there are a number of kind of worrying examples that suggest that these policies are either being ignored, jettisoned, or simply kind of just not implemented. So this is really the tension in the book that we look at. So just to recap what the main questions are from the book, we kind of group them together in 3 sets. So the first one is really looking at what the roots of climate policies in Latin America are, and why the region makes such a compelling such a compelling set of case studies. So we look at some of the drivers behind what makes Latin American countries willing to act on climate change, and some of the factors that perhaps undermine or where this willingness simply doesn't exist. Our second set of questions focuses on the negotiations and how Latin American countries have kind of emerged from this rather obscure, kind of underreported role to play a much more assertive and proactive role at the negotiations. And finally, we ask whether there are things that we can learn from Latin American countries on the global politics of climate change, and if indeed whether some of these countries can be labelled as leaders or co-leaders at the UNFCCC, or indeed at home, given their quite ambitious national climate change agenda. So that's all I'm going to say about that. So as Tim said, we've got 5 questions, so we're just going to kind of bat them between ourselves and have our panel to contribute. Thanks to Natalie for coming down from Boston. It was great to get you here. Brazil would have been a lot harder. So very convenient. And of course, Ximena and Camilla, it's great to have you here as well. And hopefully Isabel will be coming through the door any moment. So the first question really, just to kick things off, Natalie, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Sure.
What are your main takeaways from the book? And was there something new it offered in how you look at climate change politics in Latin America, if anything?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here today. And, well, on the question, I think the main takeaway for me on the book was that it provided a route for really understanding and studying climate change in the region. I think that was probably not an easy task, and certainly we don't have that kind of chart, or we didn't have it before. And the tension around the discourse and practice was really what I found most interesting. I think you started depicting like how Brazil shaped up the concept of common but differentiated responsibility, so the differentiation thing, and how that has then influenced the role, like not only Latin American but all developing countries' positions in this game. And then how countries, especially in the ILAC, have more recently challenged that conceptions and really brought new interpretations. And I really like that you brought very specific examples and very specific opinions of people from that assume different roles in the region about what it means. So I remembered particularly one comment about ambition, and seeing ambition through the lenses of some of these ILAC countries' representatives, not as a concession or as a favor, but really as something that should be taken into consideration and in the country's self-interest. So I think the book really is really colorful. It's really rich by bringing these different interpretations and starting in 2005, but arriving in Paris in 2015 with more nuances around what differentiation mean in this region, right? And something else, I don't know, I can talk for hours about the book, so you should let me know when to stop. But one important issue is that in the title, we talk about fragmentation. And it's curious because I've been touch basing with people in Brazil about their opinions on the book as well. And all of them were kind of, and these were politicians and other people involved in climate policy, and they were like, oh no, we are more into diversity, we're not so into fragmentation. And it's curious because, yes, indeed, we have a diverse perspectives in the region, and that's really good. But on the other hand, there are issues like climate finance or even forests where there are opportunities to really come together and act together. And we've seen this quite recently and lately on these opportunities becoming more concrete on really like seeing regional cooperation and regional positioning in the negotiation. So we're still in the beginning, but I think you kind of already depicted the seeds of this potential future that I hope unfolds. So.
Great, thank you, Natalie, and welcome to Isabel, who's just joined us. Just as Isabel gets settled, Camilla, would you like to jump in, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for the invitation. So happy to be here. I'll try to be very quick, but basically for me what was fascinating about the book is sort of opening this black box of domestic politics. I feel that as a student and as a researcher, most of the literature usually talks about the convention in this sort of vacuum, as if like there's the international politics and then whatever happens at home is not always relevant, which is obviously not the case, right? And so to me, kind of filling these gaps in the scholarship was very, very important, especially because being from Latin America, my interest in the region, and being interested in the region, I'm utterly frustrated with the focus on the important players, right? So I understand our focus on the US, European Union, obviously the BRICS countries. I'm not saying they're not important, of course, but at the same time, we undermine all of this learning from the global south and the examples that we find in the region by solely focusing on these others. And so for me, having this focus on what the region, which, more than 20 countries, but still a very important region, has in the role of climate politics was sort of very insightful. And then a second note was, I think the book really highlights the agency of these countries. I think Latin America is often portrayed as a receiver of aid, as a very passive player in international governance processes. And while that sometimes has been the case, it's not always, right? And so I think challenging convention and giving agency to these countries to be active players and to come up with their own solutions, and yet, being challenged by entrenched development models and development as usual is still what was quite interesting. And so showing the bargaining processes that go in these countries was actually what piqued my interest in writing a thesis about Colombia and understanding what shapes the country's foreign policy. So I guess I'm gonna leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you. Camilla, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm also very happy to be able to be here. So one of the things that I really found interesting was that the book really looks at the different blocks that are part of the negotiations and how those blocks were created in the first place and why certain countries are part of those blocks and why others aren't. And you see really the differences between these blocks at the international climate talks as blocks that sometimes have a more progressive stance and other blocks that focus more on climate justice issues and that are a bit more reluctant to kind of play a very proactive role in the negotiations. And I think the book really does a very good point in highlighting that the fact that these blocks are created in a way that reflects regional alliances and integration initiatives that have already happened in the region. And you really see that there's a link between the domestic policies and how these domestic policies are compared between the countries in the region and how those have been formed into alliances such as ALBA or the Pacific Alliance, and those ultimately are reflected in what you see as the blocks in the negotiations. And I think that really speaks to the fact that ultimately the climate policies and climate politics and approaches to international negotiations are very much an issue with economic models and development models. And I think the fact that you have these alliances that are outside of the negotiations that are not necessarily formed for climate change, they're formed for a shared set of values in terms of how countries want to develop and how they want to lead their economic models. And ultimately, the ambition that you can see at the international negotiations really depends on how much these countries see economic models as being complementary to a more climate resilient economy. So I think just the book getting at the visibility of all of these alliances of the UNFCCC and how those are related to more regional relationships between countries that are outside of climate change really highlights that there's all of these links between development, economics, and climate change as well.
Isabel, please.
Thank you,
Dive in.
Guy. And my sincere apologies for coming in late. My train was delayed and I had just travel difficulties. But of course, thank you, Guy. Thank you, Timmons, for inviting us to this presentation of what I think is a great book, not just because of its quality in its research, but because it is really filling a very interesting space that was void, I would say, in academic literature on climate change in Latin America. I would say two things on top of what my colleague panelists have said, and thank you also to all of them for being here. It's really a pleasure meeting familiar faces. I would say too, not just it is the interesting diving into the domestic politics. I think it's the first time I read such a full and overarching study on that. But it is the fact that the book successfully links domestic contexts with the positioning of those countries and blocks of countries in the international negotiation. And in particular, not just their positions, but the roles they play with respect to other actors in the negotiations. I think that's very valuable of the book. And this is connected to the second point, I would say, adding to what was previously said. I think it was very interesting to see how the book quite accurately depicts the interaction among the blocks within the region and what is the impact of those interactions in the overall negotiations. I think it's the first time I read it in such a detailed way. And I think it is particularly interesting to read in the light of, and I think this speaks to what Timmons was saying at the beginning. I'm sorry I was not here, but I was following through your webcast, COP21. So that's the marvelous technology. It links to our second question, which is the role that these blocks played in COP21. There was a shift. There was a shift from where the book really leaves us to the role that they played in COP21. Brazil, ILAC, ALBA, all of them played a role in a way, I would say, for some of them unexpected. And I think that's an interesting thing we'll probably discuss in the second question. So thank you.
I'm jumping in first with
go
one
for it.
little quick question for Isabel and Natalie. Sometimes I wonder if Latin America only exists from the perspective of Latin American studies centers in the global north. That is this a false region? And the reason why these centers exist largely was because of the Cuban Revolution, and funding came from the U.S. government under Title VI in the early 1960s, when the U.S. said, holy Moses, we don't have any capacity to understand what's going on there, and there could be a wave of communist revolutions. So, and the audacity of Northern scholars to write a book about the whole region, I mean, is this a worthwhile thing to do, or should we really not be trying to do this?
Well, I can jump in quickly. You are asking a panel of 4 Latin American women. So the answer you will get is clearly biased by our own perspective. I think if you were asking a panel of 4 European men,
I'm not asking a panel of 4
Right,
European.
I know.
Oh, there's one
but that's
European man.
it's a caveat. I think I have to say it.
Yeah.
I don't think it is audacious. I think it is actually not a false region, and your book is the best proof of it. Why? Because I think the impact the Latin American region has had in global politics, not just on climate, but the climate change example is a great one, is enormous. It's way beyond what those who are not in Latin American studies centers in the global north actually think. I think that's obvious from your book, and it's obvious for us who have been inside. I'm sure Natalie will probably report the same thing. We see it in simple things like the consultations at the most important moments of decision making have always included Latin America. And if it's just Brazil, let's say, at least it is Brazil. That's not something we're very proud of course, we who are not Brazil. But and in more recent years, it has been more than just Brazil. ALBA, ILAC have always been present at the moment where the critical decisions are being taken. So my answer is no, I don't think it's a false region.
I echo Isabel's point, but I will actually take us to. Actually, I want to use another example, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, where we does see this Latin Americans coming together and positioning themselves in a group, in GROLAC. And there would be other examples of other forums, other conventions where Latin Americans are able to cooperate and voice themselves as one, I would say, or at least with one voice, despite of the whole diversity that we see. So it's really a particularity, I would say, that in climate change, we had countries perhaps starting differently in the conversation, having different profiles of emissions, profiles of vulnerability. So there's something else here that we probably don't see in other challenges. But you were correct in saying that sometimes it sounds a little bit like a theoretical framing, right? And this is perhaps really vivid in Brazil because we don't share the same language. We are so big, so many times we feel like we have our shoulders to the rest of the region, and that's shame on us. So it's really an effort, I would say, to be more Latin American and to really do things together.
Thanks. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the second question. Isabel, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. So our question is, what does the Paris Agreement mean for Latin America, and how are Latin American countries responding to the agreement? Please.
Sure, thank you, Guy. I would say that what Timmons mentioned as the 5 good and bad things of the Paris Agreement are quite well reflected in what it means for Latin America. I won't go through the whole list because it would be too long, but I would say of course it's the early days of the Paris Agreement. We don't know what will happen if it will enter into force. We are all expecting it will. But let's say if it does, and even if it doesn't, I would say it means a lot. It means a lot because it's the first time I'm going to start by something that probably people are not so much aware of, but it's the first time a developing country made an economy-wide absolute commitment, and that was Brazil. and it is in Latin America. It is the first time several Latin American countries have taken economy-wide emissions reductions targets, even if not absolute, but that's an amazing step, technically wise, and in terms of the challenge it represents for our economies. It's the first time that even if some people might have the impression that the content of those obligations are not binding, we are actually undertaking binding obligations to reduce emissions, even if it's through this legal trick that the Paris Agreement has, where we oblige ourselves to actually identify and pursue domestic action to actually achieve the targets that we have set for ourselves. So I think in that sense, it is a major challenge, and it's something that is making climate change an issue that will necessarily go up in the agenda in all the domestic constituencies for Latin America. How are the countries responding? I think it's very early to say, but I would say that all countries, with probably rare exceptions, by the fact that they had to prepare for Paris, just by the fact that they had to come up with a plan, really made their national machinery move quicker and to a much deeper extent than it had happened before. And even countries that you would think are quote unquote less ambitious than others, like Venezuela or Bolivia, who are, you know, extractivist economies, as you well depict in your book, have come forward with a plan. We can, of course, have a discussion on, you know, the merits of each plan. But the fact of coming forward with a plan, even if we haven't started their implementation, I think has galvanized an important political momentum inside the domestic constituencies. We, of course, still have to see whether this will be a sustained effort in the future. I think because of our culture towards international developments, it will largely depend not just on our ability to continue that sustained momentum domestically, it will also largely depend on whether the Paris Agreement whole framework really continues to gain momentum internationally, because we are countries where we have a culture that really, in a way, grasps international momentum and brings it back to foster national politics and national policy making. So it remains to be seen. But I think my overall assessment is, so far, I think it's positive.
Okay, thank you, Natalie.
I think the most important signal from Paris is precisely this one about decarbonizing and increasing resilience, which is basically okay there in the national policies, national legislations that were enacted in the region after COP15. But now it's different. We're not talking only about like plans or creating governance bodies. This was done, and I don't think it was well done in all countries. I think there's a lot to happen. But basically now we have like market forces at the global level trying to align with these political messages coming from Paris. And it's not up to diplomats or negotiators anymore. It's really about, like, I believe, and I would love to see planning ministries, finance ministries really walking this talk. And this is not an easy task, we all know, especially in countries like Brazil, that was investing so heavily in the pre-salt oil extraction. Well, is it still doing so? And actually we just seen new investments and cuts in investments on other renewables like solar and so on. It's important for Venezuela. I believe it's in a very difficult situation and can become even worse. So what it means for Venezuela as part of the OPEC, which is also moving towards new directions. We see Saudi Arabia now, we see the UAE trying to diversify their economy. So what it means for these countries, and we could go on and go into each one of the countries in Latin America that is already being hit by these two factors, the impacts of climate change and the decarbonization. So I think this is a very important dimension. And one thing, another signal that is under the Paris Agreement is precisely that of linking adaptation and mitigation. we don't talk much about it, but there is something there called the Global Adaptation Goal, which means, in my opinion, like this, these two objectives coming together. So really like managing risks, which is then the meaning for Latin America. I think it's precisely like to have a better or a more resilient agriculture and so on. So there are these two dimensions which are important, and I think countries are slowly responding or starting to kind of give their own signals to their own constituencies. In the case of Brazil, that I've been following more closely, I think the signals are not precise. They're very confusing, but this is also related to the political and economic instability that we are living now. And I hope we have better and more or corrected signals in the short term. Let's see.
Thank you, Natalie. Camilla?
Yes, I'll try to be very brief because I think both of you have touched on really, really important things. I think Paris is a symbol. I see it as, yes, obviously it's international law, so it does have binding mechanisms and some non-binding ones. But it's also a symbol to think of climate change as something different. And what do I mean by this? I think it's an opportunity for people to realize that this is not something in the long run. It's not something that is going to impact us in 20 years. It already is. But in some ways, it's kind of fostering those very domestic but very important conversations around climate change. And an opportunity for citizens to push on their governments and say, you said this at Paris, you promised this, you pledged this through your climate plan. And I think that's the key, right? Having that accountability come from the bottom. And the second thing I'll say is that the process of creating this agreement, it's been 20 years, right? 20 years of negotiations, some failures, some successes. And I think the process that's been started since the INDC, which was the climate plan process, is significant. I mean, for the first time, you have ministries of finance, the planning departments talking to the environment ministry about climate change. And it's not just an environmental thing anymore, right? It's a development issue. And I think that is very, very significant when you start having these conversations between the private sector and civil society, not just being traditional NGOs, but also citizens and other groups who see climate change as an issue that is no longer a polar bear issue, right? And to me, that has been something that without this international process and without having an agreement, probably wouldn't have happened. So that international push, I think, it means a lot for what we can do within our countries.
Great. Thank you, Camilla. Jimena, please.
Yeah, I would also echo a lot of the things that have been said before about the process. Particularly, I think it's important that these processes included very interesting parts. For example, many Latin American countries also engaged citizens, not necessarily in terms of civil society organizations or NGOs, but also they opened it up to a public consultation where everyone pretty much could just come. It depends, of course, and there's varying opinions of whether or not this was actually a very democratic process or not. But I think it's important that there was still at least some kind of signal from these countries that they wanted to engage with citizens and take into account those impacts, because ultimately the impacts that Latin America is going to feel with regards to climate change are not just economic, but they're very much human losses in many respects. Another thing I think is important is that it was a process that also leveraged a lot of technical knowledge that was developed, and this was in part building scenarios and understanding where do your emissions come. And of course, there were efforts before, and I think the process of the INDCs was built upon these efforts, but it really led to countries to understand better where they're standing in terms of the climate impact that they can have. And I think that's really important for them to realize that it's not just about mitigation, but also, I think particularly for Latin America, there's a lot of issues with adaptation, and that I think can be used as a sort of a tool to kind of bring countries to realize that they also need to take some more concrete actions. As far as the response, I think the political part is of course very, very difficult to see because it's been a very recent agreement, but I think it's also interesting to look at the media and how the media is responding, and how that is being, how the media is engaging the citizens. And what is seen in the region, I think, generally is that the media coverage is very low, and it generally only reflects speeches that politicians make at the beginning of the climate talks or at the end of the climate talks. So it's very much focused on what a certain important person says, like the Pope or your president or the minister of a country. And I think that's really important to kind of like trying to understand the narratives that are going on in these countries, especially from high-level politicians. But in general, I think what is missing in the media is more of a letting the people know what exactly that agreement means in terms of your life and your quality of life as a citizen in a city or in a rural area or as a farmer. And I think it's really important to see the media as a catalyzer for civic engagement and civil society organizations, and having these people move towards holding governments accountable, because ultimately the implementations of these agreements are going to rely in a large part on citizens and how they mobilize to make sure that all of these agencies and institutions that have been engaged in the process are also accountable.
We should move on to the next question, I think.
Okay, yeah, so question 3, if you could all be rather brief, just so we could squeeze in all the questions. We've covered this a little bit, but any insights, further insights would be fantastic. So the question is about whether Latin American countries can be considered leaders at the UNFCCC, and in particular in Paris during the last COP, when this deal came together. There was a lot of things going on where the media and NGOs didn't have access, these kind of last-minute deals, wranglings, arm twisting, general schmoozing going on. So how did this happen, and can you provide any further insights about that, please, Isabel?
Thank you. I thank you for always giving me the privilege of starting. This is always not the easy point to be. But I guess from my own perspective, and this is a very personal, all of my comments are personal, my personal view. I would say yes. In very different ways, Latin America played a leading role through Paris. And I'm going to give you 3 examples that speak to what the book really highlights. One is Brazil. We know that there's, and I think the book describes it really well, how Brazil, when the Dilma government came, there was in a way some disenchantment with Brazil's ambition. But the fact that Brazil was the first developing country, as I said, in the world, to have such an ambitious INDC, I think was a game changer. It was a game changer for the basic group. Brazil with South Africa both started, and Natalie is more in a position to speak about this, but at least from our outsider's perspective, they started to deviate a little bit from the hardcore basic positions that China and India were defending. They were not part of the LMDC, of which China and India were. So these
That's
made
the like-minded developing countries.
My apologies for that. That's the like-minded developing countries. That is a group that has most of the oil-producing developing countries, including India and China. The fact that Brazil deviated from that and started holding more constructive positions was truly a game-changing factor. So I think in that sense, they had a very important role through Paris. I could go along for a lot longer on Brazil's role, but I'm gonna go through ALBA. ALBA is traditionally seen by outsiders as a group that is making their argument on climate justice, but being not very progressive in climate negotiations. I think Venezuela had an important role in Paris by, first of all, announcing they would actually have an INDC when nobody was expecting they would do before Paris, which I think was significant. And second, Venezuela has a very well-known negotiator who took a positive, proactive role in the Paris Agreement, I think by a very smart move by the French, in coordinating and negotiating the preamble of the agreement. So Venezuela had an important role. It was, and I think this, and it also, I think they had a role in keeping the ALBA, under, more or less, under the expectation that the Paris would deliver. Although one of the ALBA members, as you know, is Nicaragua, who was the only country who in the end had problems with the agreement. And finally, ILAC. I think the Paris COP was kind of the moment that ILAC had been expecting since it started existing in 2012. I think the whole rationale for creating ILAC was going towards Paris. It was created right after Durban, and with the idea of pushing for an ambitious, legally binding agreement. So that was at its core, and I think it did deliver in Paris that purpose. It consolidated itself as a group with very sophisticated positions that if you check ILAC's submission from September 2014, it's outstanding how much similarity between that submission and the outcome of the Paris deal is.
Which one? The legal architecture
Right.
one? That one.
Right.
Okay.
That was a combined submission. One with the it had a legal architecture and structure of the Paris Agreement. So of course there are differences, but the bigger picture that those submissions portrayed in September 2014 is what more or less you can see in the structure of the Paris deal today. So that's a proof of how ILAC, I think, consolidated its leadership through Paris. I'll leave it at that because I'm sure I can be complimented very well by my colleagues. Thank you.
Camilla? Oh, sorry,
I don't
Natalie.
No,
Natalie,
I actually
sorry.
think Isabella covered. Covered most of the points that.
Yeah, I want to kind of disagree agreeing. I think Brazil has always positioned itself as a go-between, as a sort of mediator, and kind of avoided this, let's say, discourse of like bragging leadership, I would say. In this sense, I agree with Isabel that Brazil moved it towards a more moderate field instead of positioning so in the extreme, I would say. So came closer, especially, although a bit confusing, but Brazil indeed participated of the High Ambition Coalition, and I think that was strategic in the sense that it was a way of signaling, hey, we are not going to go with the basic, or don't take us as part of the basic as granted, like we are seeing the whole picture here. So I think that was very positive, and also like this, one thing that I think it was also voiced by Brazil, but I saw a sort of echo in the region, or maybe it was Brazil echo in the region, which was this idea that the agreement would need not only the major emitters but the vulnerable ones. So this new equilibrium was brought, and I think that was a kind of mediation that was extremely important. I would put ILAC in a position of those exercising leadership. I think ILAC, as was mentioned here, was real in its positions for a long time, and then we had Cristiana Figueiredo, so we had a lot of roles being played, and they came together. You didn't ask for that, but I have to mention here that I think Argentina played an interesting role, not a very positive one, I would say. So I have expectations for the new government with Macri, because Cristina Kirchner was the one kind of leading her delegation in Paris, but I saw Argentina kind of more into the like-minded mindset, I would say, and as a country that can highly invest in shale gas and so on in the future, I think Argentina is some country or a country to be closely watched in the future.
I have to ask you, though, that's really helpful points, but I wanted to, I guess I have two questions in here. One is about the Brazilian pledge. While it is absolute reductions, Brazil has already reduced its emissions so strongly by getting the emissions, down in the Amazon by 3/4, roughly 75% from its high in 2004. Did this pledge was it really an ambitious pledge, or was it really, because environmentalists were not happy with the pledge, Brazilian environmentalists.
So this is your first
That's
question?
the first question, yeah.
Okay, thank you for bringing that, because this is really a great opportunity to say that for Brazilian NGOs, social movements, and etc., Brazil lacked leadership in this matter, precisely because although the metric is really good, like the absolute target, I think as Isabel just pointed here, like other countries saw that as a positive move, but for those that have to live up to that target, that was not only not enough, but really lacks meaning in terms of what are going to be the investments in the energy and agriculture, which are now kind of producing more and more emissions. So we have the baseline of 2005, which coincides with the peak of emissions of deforestation in the country. So that helps, in a sense, achieving it. But more than that, I think we saw this economy-wide target, but no clear signals for the market players in the energy and agriculture sector about what are going to be their responsibilities in the future, and that's very disappointing.
And those emissions are rising very strongly
Exactly,
on
and balancing the gains that we
fossil
had
fuels.
in the past.
and agriculture. So the second question was about the role of the Cartagena dialogue. So this was I guess, largely led by Latin America. It's some of the history we talk about in here. Do we know how this was a sort of an informal group that meets behind the scenes and has been since 2010, right after the mess in Copenhagen? Do we know how much of a role they played in the Paris year, and especially in Paris? That is, it provided the opportunity for countries across the different divides to actually talk to each other.
My answer is I think the dialogue played a very important role in the long term between 2010 and 2015. By 2015, the dialogue had gone through several different phases of being very active and producing, quite substantively what became the outcome of, for example, COP16 in Cancun, to a lower profile, output or non-output during 2014, for example, which is, I think, quite normal because of the nature of the group, which is very, very loose. And its purpose is not to produce an outcome, it is to
Right.
foster dialogue. I think that longer term period of time where the dialogue created a space where countries could speak was enormously helpful. I wouldn't say that the dialogue in the end said, okay, this is how it looks, and this is what it became. It was not its purpose, but in creating that space, I think it was a successful achievement. And I would say, perhaps from the outside, people would expect the dialogue was going to impact much more openly and directly the negotiations. And if you look at it compared to something like the High Ambition Coalition, which was highly mediatic, and had a huge political impact in Paris itself, that coalition was built over a few months. But I don't think that coalition would have probably been as strong and as broad as it was if it hadn't had a lot of, even symbolic and quite of a psychological work that had been done year after year by the Cartagena dialogue. And so that's how I would assess the dialogue. It's kind of a long run breadth of impact rather than something that you could say, okay, in Paris we sat down and wrote the text, because I think that's not what it was for. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Camilla or Jimena, would you like to add anything to the question about whether Latin America was a leader in Paris or not? Well, we can.
Sure,
Please, yeah.
I can add something small.
Yeah.
I think also the leadership that was shown in terms of diplomacy and how countries were more visible in the negotiations, I think it's also a result or a reflection of the fact that Latin America as a region is becoming more and more so an economic power, and it's been taken more seriously because it's also having kind of this more push for agency, and then they're not aid receivers, or they're making their own partnerships. They're allying with other countries in the region, with China, with India, and I think they're not having a rhetoric that is so much about dependency on others and dependency on aid from the industrialized world, but they're having much more of a rhetoric that speaks to collaboration and partnerships. And I think that's something that they really want to make visible in these negotiations and international forums. So.
Thank you. We're almost running out of time, so I'm just going to try and just pretty much tie together the last two questions. So we wanted to ask about what the prospects are for increasing climate action in Latin America and some of the obstacles undermining it. And also, just to kind of add to that, you've all been incredibly polite about what the book does do. So I think Timmins and I would both agree what we left out, what we missed, what we didn't get quite right. I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit about that. So if we perhaps tie those two questions together for this final couple of minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes or so for some quick questions. Isabel.
Thanks.
please.
I would say the prospects domestically are mixed, and they are much more complicated than what one would expect if you were just looking at the leadership that the countries have been exerting internationally. And that is because so far, and I'm sorry, Guy, but I have to say you have well depicted that in the book. So far, Latin America has been able to capitalize leadership on low-hanging fruit in terms of their ability to show themselves, to show themselves as quite ambitious and green. But that's going to become harder as development, moves forward, and especially harder as climate change impacts come to our countries. So I think the prospects are mixed because we are currently sitting at a crossroad. Being ambitious sustainably in the long term will cost more from now on. And I think this is the case for most of the Latin American countries. But it will, of course, it will save us costs in the future. But currently, because we all have quite short-term domestic political cycles, it's hard to see political leaders that would have enough political weight nationally that they can engage themselves in policies that are highly costly today to ensure a better future in terms of climate action. So I would say that for that to happen, we would need to really have a much stronger civil society movement than what we've had. I think some countries have stronger than others in Latin America, but in general, the picture is that we need them to be stronger. It's one of the 4 things that you've analyzed in your book, and I think that if that doesn't happen into the future, our prospect is probably just that we're going to be in a much more difficult situation to sustain leadership. What the book missed is an interesting question. I would say I would think it's interesting. It would be interesting to see a little bit more in depth the impact that Latin America's blocks have into other sub-regional groups or regional groups. So, for example, the relationships between the Latin American countries and Asia, not just with China, but with Southeast Asia, with the Pacific, between CARICOM and the Pacific Islands, that have been deeply fractured within AOSIS and created a paralysis in the group that really made the group lose a lot of its impact in the negotiations. That's just one example. Or the relationship between Latin America and Africa. If you look at it, Brazil has as one of its main foreign policy objectives to, strengthen its links to Africa, strengthen South-South cooperation. But are we really engaging with Africa? And how is Africa responding to that? Is China colonizing all the space that we have to engage with Africa or not? So that's just one point I think that could be the purpose of future research. And of course, the obvious one is INDC's implementation, right? You've sort of laid the ground to where we are right now. It would be really great to see live how institutions in the Latin American countries are working together in order to make or not their INDC pledges a reality. And that's something that could be researched pretty much as it evolves in the next 4 years.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Natalie, please.
I don't know where to start. Maybe with the book. I think you did a great job. You already said that, but some areas that I think were less, let's say, colorful were forests. I think we have a very, very important story about deforestation and how countries in the region, I wouldn't say countries, I think what is missing in the book is precisely how civil society played such a bold role in creating discussion spaces for addressing this, which then led into governmental policies. But I think this is one area that deserves more attention. And I think the Caribbean Latin American relationship is also one area that I really would love to see more exploration, because the ILAC and not the ILAC, sorry, the IOSIS and the other groupings, where they see more Caribbean leadership are so important, and so I think this is another group, I would say, that should be explored in the future. And in terms of the prospects and the obstacles, I mentioned Argentina as one country that I think deserves more attention. And the area which I see some obstacles, but also some opportunities, is precisely like the new geography of energy in the region. Due to climate impacts, we see that those, and you say that in the book, we see that countries that are relying on hydropower today, like Brazil and others, Colombia, they will have less space to rely or to deal with that in the future. Except Ecuador, all of these countries will have higher costs for operation, more shortages, and so on. So, and then of course, like the lower oil prices now that supposedly are gonna stay here like that for a while. So this will probably bring new actors like Argentina and Ecuador with a new role in the region, and we will see some new moves. And I think this is one area where the connection between energy and climate change is not well explored. And there's a lot to say about this oil and gas diplomacy in relation to positions. So, yeah.
That's equally extremely helpful. Thank you. Camilla.
Yes, so I think I'll start with the obstacles to climate action in the region. And I think I touched earlier on this, but I think for me, one of them is that climate change is still seen as an environmental issue. And the problem with that is that we're not making the connections, and when I say we, it's like the population, the 45 million Colombians, for instance, in Colombia, or the population of Brazil. Like, we're not making the connections between the droughts, between El Nino, between the melting of glaciers, between the really strange temperatures we've been getting. And I think there is room to utilize this as a political opportunity to explain people why is climate change going to mean to them? What does it mean to them now? What will it mean to them in the next 10, 15, 20 years? And I think this is somewhere where civil society itself can take upon. And I think the second obstacle is finance. And when I don't necessarily mean external finance or the financial mechanisms that can exist under the convention, but the mechanisms within our own countries to start financing this shift, right? We need to start financing mitigation. If hydro is going to be affected, as you said, we need to start thinking about alternative energy, and we need to think about resilience in our agriculture, resilience in our communities, in cities, for instance, right? Latin America is the most urban region in the world. We need to think about resilience in our cities. But if those financial mechanisms are not in place to steer South-South cooperation, to steer public-private partnerships, then we're not going to be able to do that, because the money is not going to be there. And at the end of the day, this is a little bit cynical on my part, but we need those financial mechanisms to be there. So those I see as the two main obstacles. But I see a lot of prospects, and so I see a lot of things coming from the bottom up. And I mentioned this, and I think something that the book didn't necessarily touch upon, because it's an overview of 20 countries, but future research might look into this, is the role of subnational initiatives, of non-state actors, of not only NGOs, but the private sector, and citizen initiatives. I mean, just a few days ago, I ran into something called the Low Carbon City Forum, and it's the first forum for low-carbon cities started by citizens that's going to happen in Colombia this October. And it's global, right? It's people from all over the world coming to talk about the kinds of cities they imagine. And although this is not just related to climate change, right? It's related to other things. It's essentially about our resources, how we manage waste, water, energy. And again, what is our role in sort of owning these agreements? And so the convention came out a few days ago with like hashtag what means for you or something, and it's encouraging people to tweet about what the Paris Agreement means to them, and not just individuals, but like enterprises, companies. And I think that's sort of the initiative we need to keep seeing more. Like obviously we need governments, obviously states and their policies are very important, but what's happening under all of that?
Okay, thank you very much, Jimena.
Yes, I'll start also with the barriers. I think the one that I see as a big barrier for the implementation is particularly institutionalization and how this agreement is going to be moved forward internally in the country due to institutional memory as well, because I feel like there's a lot of changes in leadership roles, and I feel like this process has been led by people who are very passionate about the issues, and they've talked to a lot of different peoples in different sectors, different ministries, but how that is going to be able to keep moving forward as leadership roles change, I think is a very interesting question, because we can't only depend on certain people that are trying to push this agenda, but it needs to be something that is really solid and stays as a plan within different ministries. And just to put an example, in Peru, for example, we've had over the past 5 years around 50 different ministers holding positions for 19 different ministries. So there's a lot of turnover in terms of like who is really leading institutions. And I think in particular, taking this into account in presidential elections, for example, in Peru, we're having elections in a couple of months. The priorities and the narratives that leaders are using, I think, are really interesting to look at and see how they are really trying to institutionalize the policies. So I think in terms of another question that could be asked is not just opening perhaps the black box of domestic policies, but also opening the black box of bureaucracies. And I think there's a lot of weaknesses and institutional issues that are going to have to be addressed there. And as far as the priorities, I think it's also interesting to look at the region in terms of how it's going through an economic downturn, an economic recess, and I think this is also going to impact how the region is going to move forward and realign the priorities that they have in terms of climate change. Because a lot of the initiatives and a lot of the institutions that were created for climate change in the region also came about in a moment in which the region was kind of walking towards progress, right? And they were alleviating poverty, so they were doing relatively well. And now I think a lot of the talk is how do we move forward, and I think that's going to complicate a lot in terms of energy, in terms of what the economies are betting on to move forward. So I think it's also important to look at how those priorities are aligned and how the climate risks are perceived, and how that perception also is translated into the policies in the end.
Those were all fantastic. That really was
Fantastic.
great to hear all of that. Thank you. We were meant to finish at 12:30, so we're meant to kind of finish now. But Rich, could we take some questions, or should we take it outside for the coffee and have something more?
I think we should
informal?
take it outside with the food and the drinks and so on. So please, if that's all right, anybody object?
There's a little bit of food out there, and
We have some lunch.
another event here.
Right.
if you
Yeah.
want.
Oh, yeah,
So
we
we
don't have
better go
time.
out.
So we will have to
One option,
break
let's
this up.
throw it out. We could end and hang out there, or we could just collect questions, and then we go out there, and people can sort of discuss and answer out there.
Yeah.
However you want to do it.
I think we have the room actually rich until 2 o'clock, so we can,
Oh,
if you
okay.
wanna mingle within here, mingle outside, it's kind of an open area, so.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I guess,
Yeah.
I don't like not having question and answers, so I apologize to people for that. But I think we should break and have some food. And please stay around and talk to our speakers. And shall we cut it out there?
Yeah.
Join us in thanking them for traveling here, and look forward to the exciting work of these two amazing young women, a sophomore and a senior. How about that? Junior. You're a junior, but it says 2018.
A little mistake.
Okay. That is, I thought it was like, wait a minute. Anyway, so remarkable young women who have been to 2 and 4 negotiations, respectively, UN negotiations, and have an amazing experience. So thank you all. That was extremely insightful.
And thank you, Isabel and Natalie, for joining us.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.